In July last year, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was on this crucial diplomatic visit to China, attempting to stabilise what had been a rather volatile relationship. Yet just as Albo was nailing the usual photo ops, someone at the US State Department leaked a story to the Financial Times.
The Financial Times reported on July 13th that US Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby has been asking US allies Japan and Australia over the past few months how they would act in any war over Taiwan.
Which is, straight up, a bit rich, considering the USA has long maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity over whether it would even help Taiwan if China invaded. But Colby, who effectively confirmed the report with a social media post, wasn't really trying to get an answer. He was trying to ensure that the question was asked of the Prime Minister while he was in China, surrounded by Chinese media, and with the Chinese ambassador to Australia in the room. And it worked.
What role would Australia play if the US and China went to war over Taiwan?
Look, our aim of investing in our capability and as well investing in our relationships is about advancing peace and security in our region.
This was a shameless attempt to make things awkward between Australia and China by attempting to force us to discuss the issue of Taiwan and the prospect of war, just as we were beginning to discuss some crucial trade deals. Now, to be fair, I don't think Trump was behind this. I genuinely don't know how confident I am that he could actually find Australia on a map. I assume he could, but it also wouldn't really shock me if we found out that he couldn't, let's be honest. But this was Colby, and it was intended to warn the Australian Prime Minister that he would have to pick a side. And considering Colby was the man at the Pentagon who was deciding whether or not Australia would receive the nuclear submarines we've been promised, the message was pretty clear. Now, the problem is, for the first time in Australian-US relations, it's no longer obvious whose side Washington is actually on. In many ways, the USA has become everything we feared China could be. A military superpower unapologetically imposing itself on other countries under no other pretext other than to ensure their obedience, openly attempting to interfere in the democratic processes and even the judicial processes of other countries, and of course using its extraordinary economic power to intimidate, influence, and extort the rest of the world. So, what does this mean for China? Have we misunderstood this rising power? Are they actually the good guys here? Or have we now just got two authoritarian superpowers to worry about instead of one? So, let's talk about China.
So under this scenario, we're spending close to $30 billion a year to protect our trade with China from China. And that doesn't strike anyone at this table as odd?
I don't recall how I got there, but I ended up on this Reddit forum where Australians share photos of old shopping catalogues because that's what I assume the internet was created for. And a few things jumped out at me. First of all, this toy might explain why so many men my age are infatuated with lawns, clearly. But also this, from 2001. That's a 23-inch colour TV selling at a massive $100 discount for $662. Now, using the RBA's inflation calculator, in today's money, that's more than $1,200. Yet if you look at the same store today, you can buy a 24-inch flat-screen TV with a multitude of new features for $149, almost a tenth of the cost. You can even buy a 55-inch 4K high-definition TV, literally twice the size, for $399. And I swear to God, Big W, if you sell a single TV because of this, I expect a commission. I'll put my bank details in the description. There are several reasons why TVs are so much cheaper today compared to 25 years ago, but no factor is more important than China's manufacturing. By building factories at scale for a global market, they've managed to make almost everything cheaper. And it's not just toys, clothes, and electronics. The only reason that solar power has become economically viable is because China makes 90% of them, which has reduced their cost by 90% in the last 15 years. There's a long list of basic medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and industrial equipment that China has made incomparably cheaper for the whole world. And while some might lament aspects of this phenomenon, it has transformed our lives, in many ways for the better. You're probably watching this on something made in China. You're probably sitting on a couch, bed, or mattress made in China. And because it's made in China, they are infinitely more affordable than they would have otherwise been. This has been a pretty good deal for Australians because while China has been building things for the whole world, they've been doing so with our iron, which they turn into steel using our coal. So as long as you didn't work in the manufacturing industry, it meant that we can buy more things for less. Until something like this happens.
According to the Wall Street Journal, China is planning to block companies connected to the US military from accessing rare earth magnets. Those magnets are used in fighter jets, submarines, missiles.
This was a power move by President Xi that effectively ended Trump's ill-considered trade war, but it was also a pretty unsettling demonstration of just how dependent the entire world had become on China's manufacturing. Because rare earths are just one example of things that we can produce ourselves, but just nowhere near as cheaply as China can, so we just stopped. In many instances, the Chinese government gave out so many subsidies to their state-owned companies that no other private companies could compete. So we no longer have the infrastructure in place to make a lot of the things that we rely on, and that makes us pretty vulnerable, especially if our military relies on these products to be able to do their job. So the answer might feel simple, right? Don't start a trade war with China and everything will be fine, right? Well, it's not always up to us. Remember at the height of the COVID pandemic, and our then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said this.
We will need an independent inquiry that looks at what has occurred here so we can learn the lessons. Now, we'd like the world to be safer when it comes to viruses. It seems like a pretty honest ambition that I'm sure most people in the world would agree with. So it'd be great if we could achieve that, and that's the spirit in which we're pursuing this, and I would certainly hope that any other nation, be it China or anyone else, would share that objective.
Now, I remember being very critical of old ScoMo when he made those remarks, but it's worth saying that there's nothing inherently wrong with suggesting we hold an inquiry into what caused an event that shut down the global economy, reversed average life expectancy of humanity across the planet, and caused millions of middle-aged men like me to start their own podcast. I did like 4 episodes and then took up mountain biking instead, by the way. But the criticism I had of Morrison wasn't that he was wrong. It was that saying something like this was always going to piss off the Chinese government, who were a little bit sensitive about this topic, not least of all for the manner in which it had led to rare expressions of public dissent within China. Now, the Australian government spent months seeking a diplomatic channel to hear Beijing's grievances. Beijing refused to take the call. This was an intentional humiliation of Scott Morrison, a punishment for his recalcitrance. They effectively suspended all diplomatic engagement and arbitrarily shut down a mutually beneficial trade arrangement because they know that it hurts us more than it hurts them. So with several Australian industries suddenly cut off from their largest export market, the Chinese government then decided to effectively set its terms for a resumption of trade, not through diplomatic channels, but by leaking a list of 14 grievances to the Australian media.
November 2020, inside this Canberra hotel, China's 14 grievances with Australia were handed to Nine News by a Chinese embassy official. On the list, Australia's foreign investment decisions to block Chinese companies on national security grounds, banning Huawei from the rollout of the 5G network, the Australian government's call for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, and speaking out on issues in the South China Sea, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. It also objected to criticism of China by MPs and the media. The official said if you make China the enemy, China will be the enemy.
This is the part that far too many people have forgotten. The Chinese government weren't just trying to get our Prime Minister to watch his language. They wanted a say in our national security laws. They wanted a say in which Chinese citizens we let into our country, and even how our media reports on them. That is genuinely concerning. That is a threat to our sovereignty, a threat to our democracy and our core values. If you search for information on the Tiananmen Square massacre on the internet from within China, you will enter a reality where it never happened. This is a society where free thought is not allowed. And frankly, I get frustrated when I see people who spend their lives complaining about the government and social media now championing a system of government where that very act would see them arrested. China ranks 178th out of 180 countries on the Press Freedom Index. It's estimated they have more than 50,000 political prisoners, and they execute thousands of prisoners every year. And while Amnesty International is confident that it's far more than any other nation, we really don't know the exact number because there is no transparency or accountability for this regime. We need to be wide-eyed about what is at stake here because this isn't hyperbole. The Chinese government attempted to impose on Australia the same rules of censorship that it uses to silence criticism of its rule from within China. Now, people often talk about how the Israeli lobby shut down criticism. Do you remember what happened when an NBA coach expressed solidarity with pro-democracy campaigners in Hong Kong? John Cena was forced to publicly apologise for accidentally calling Taiwan a country. In 2018, the Marriott hotel chain briefly listed Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Macau separately in a customer survey. The Chinese government shut down their website and forced them to apologise. Mercedes-Benz were forced to apologise and delete a social media post because it quoted the Dalai Lama. China already uses its substantial economic might to impose self-censorship on most of the world. Our media, especially the ABC, must be free to report the truth, otherwise it is not the truth.
While Chinese state media has also fiercely rounded on Morrison. The editor-in-chief of one paper wrote online that Australia was, quote, a bit like chewing gum stuck on the sole of China's shoes. Sometimes you have to find a stone to rub it off.
Now, in this instance, the Australian government held the line and refused to submit to Beijing's demands, thanks in part to a broad bipartisan domestic support for that stance, as well as strong diplomatic support from the US, UK and Europe. And trade has slowly returned to normal under a new government that chooses its words far more carefully. For now, anyway. But it's worth remembering, we're not the only one they've done this to. So it's fairly naive to believe they won't try again, especially as the West isn't quite as united as we used to be. It's also prudent to recognise that recent wars in Ukraine and Iran have revealed just how important manufacturing capacity is in modern warfare. How many drones could we mass produce if we needed to in a hurry? How much steel could we produce? How secure are our trade routes? These are the considerations that the governments of any Western democracy should be taking really seriously right now. But while our dependence on Chinese manufacturing has created a genuine national security vulnerability, it is also something that we should be celebrating. It's been great for us. China's extraordinary period of industrialization resulted in 28 unbroken years of sustained economic growth for Australia. Things were getting cheaper and the country was getting richer, and our trade relationship with China got us through the GFC virtually unscathed. This is the economy that most of us grew up in, and is one of the only reasons that Australia didn't really experience the same right-wing populism of the 2010s seen in Europe and the USA, because we weren't radicalised by economic collapse in the same way, though that luck may now be running out. It's also just objectively good that millions of Chinese are no longer languishing in poverty. It's genuinely amazing that so many Chinese are now enjoying a quality of life most in the West have enjoyed for decades. Though it's worth remembering why they were languishing in poverty to begin with. Taiwan, South Korea, Japan and Hong Kong were just as poor after World War II. Japan was flattened. They'd had 2 nuclear bombs dropped on them. They lost nearly 3 million men while millions more were physically and emotionally scarred. Yet they were our biggest trading partner by 1971. Meanwhile, around the same time, 45 million Chinese were dying of starvation. This wasn't just bad socialist ideology, it was the consequence of the authoritarian regime that remains in power today. Just like Mao's horrific cultural revolution and the countless cultures that have been erased, there's been no reckoning or contrition for these crimes. The same men are still in power, and their crimes are continuing. The Uyghurs of Xinjiang are not Chinese. They have never wanted to be part of China, and they clearly still don't. There is so much evidence of what is going on there, and it is dystopian. Over 1 million Uyghurs rounded up and forced to attend re-education camps for months or even years until the regime believes they can be safely monitored in one of the most advanced surveillance states imaginable. And please, stop saying China never invaded anyone. You've probably watched a whole movie about it. And one of the reasons the Korean War was so devastating was because China sent in millions of troops to establish what would become one of the most oppressive regimes in history. They also invaded Vietnam in 1979, by the way, and the only reason they haven't invaded Taiwan yet is because they couldn't. They didn't have the navy. They now have the largest navy on Earth, and they are building naval bases on reefs that are clearly within the territorial waters of other countries that the UN has ruled to be illegal. And to be clear, the problem isn't the Chinese people. I think Australians and Chinese get along pretty well, actually. The issue is that China is currently run by a dictator. That makes things more volatile because it allows a single man's emotional response to become policy. The president has usurped control of the state. He has purged the party of all opposition and promoted an ultra-hostile foreign policy posture that seems to celebrate the ability to bully the world. No, sorry, wrong president. The president has usurped control of the state. He has purged the party of all opposition and promoted an ultra-hostile foreign policy posture that seems to celebrate his ability to bully the world, and has ended term limits, essentially making himself dictator for life. So, see, Trump can't do that. There are 2 mainstream political schools of thought in regards to Australia's foreign policy towards China. Those that see a rising China as an existential threat that must be suppressed, by force if necessary. They believe that war is inevitable, so it's best that it happens before the balance of power shifts. And then there are those that recognise the incredible potential China has to lead the world through the next century, to be a great innovator and an industrial powerhouse that can fuel our economy and potentially drag millions more out of poverty, but that also recognise the threat of a world dominated by a totalitarian regime. Now, it's that second group that China have the best chance of reaching, if they want to. Now, I'm realistic enough to understand that the political system within China is not going to be liberalised as a result of Western diplomatic pressure. I remember when I visited China and considering whether it was simply too large and diverse to be governed by a democratic institution. Now, I concluded that it probably could, but I understand the reasons to doubt that. I'm also interested in their economic model, to be honest, and I wonder if there are some elements of that we could consider adopting. I like the fact that they don't allow oligarchs to attain too much power, even if their motives aren't exactly altruistic. I understand that Hong Kong is lost. Its democracy has been extinguished. It's not coming back. But Beijing must respect the will of 23 million Taiwanese. The CCP has no genuine moral claim to it, and it has never governed it. And if it demonstrates its will to use its overwhelming military strength to subjugate tens of millions of people against their will, then they are a threat to all of us. President Xi could remove that tension immediately by simply ruling out the use of military force to achieve his goal of reunification. The fact that he refuses to do that should make us all nervous. If we are to avoid an increasingly fragmented and protectionist world, building trust has to become a priority. And that trust cannot simply be negotiated by governments. It has to be something that we develop between ordinary people. We need more travel, more academic exchange, more cultural engagement, and greater openness. Let more people come and visit China. Let journalists, more importantly, report freely and fearlessly from within China. Let each side see the other with their own eyes rather than through the lens of propaganda or political rhetoric. Because trust cannot just be demanded. It has to be earned through openness, transparency, and genuine human engagement. And until that happens, then we have no option other than to be cautious or even suspicious of each other. And it makes it far harder to keep the hawks from beating the drums of war. Now, the truth is, so long as Trump is in power, Australia will be wise to back away slowly from the USA. But while his actions against Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba are illegal at this stage, he doesn't have the political power to invade Greenland or Canada, which, when you say it out loud, sounds absolutely insane. But President Xi does have that power, and he wants the world to know that he has that power, and he wants the world to know that that power is growing. So until we know how he's going to use that power, we should not forget how he's used that power so far.